Not a single word. As the fleet finalized its formation and officers toasted what they spoke of openly as an inevitable conquest, Admiral Krell stood at the panoramic viewport of his command deck and studied the quiet stars ahead with the measured calm of a man who had won wars before. But something in that quiet gnawed at him, something small, irrational, that he dismissed the moment it surfaced. He dismissed it too quickly. The Orion fleet crossed the border into human space on a Tuesday, by the human calendar, a detail no one in the Alliance knew or cared about. No alarm sounded. No automated defense grid sprang to life. No warships materialized from hyperspace to contest the incursion. The stars ahead looked exactly as they had looked on the other side of the border, cold, indifferent, and infinite. The fleet advanced in perfect formation, battleships at the vanguard, their engines burning steady and bright. Officers monitored their sensor arrays with expressions of growing confidence. Mining operations continued on nearby asteroids, mechanical arms turning slowly in the dark, or processors cycling through their routines without interruption. Cargo haulers traced their scheduled routes between waypoints. Civilian traffic meandered through the system like it was any ordinary day. No one reacted to the presence of several hundred warships. Admiral Krell stood at the center of his command deck, watching the holographic tactical display. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Do they not understand what is coming?" he asked, not quite directing the question at anyone. No one answered, because no one knew. The fleet's first objective was a small human settlement wrapped around a frozen moon, a colony of perhaps 12,000, according to intelligence reports. Thermal imaging confirmed active power systems. Life signs read as normal. The colony was inhabited, functioning, entirely ordinary. It was also completely undefended. Landing craft descended through the thin atmosphere in tight formation, troops sealed inside their combat harnesses, expecting the chaos of first contact, the panic, the scramble, the desperate resistance of an unprepared population. The soldiers had rehearsed for this. They knew how frightened people behaved. The colony was empty. Not destroyed, not evacuated in panic. Simply empty. Lights glowed warmly inside buildings. Meals sat half-finished on tables, food still faintly warm. Children's toys lay scattered on the floors of living quarters, as if their owners had set them down to do something and would return in a moment. Doors stood open to the cold. Vehicles sat where they'd been parked, engines cold. The entire settlement breathed with electricity and heat, and the soft hum of machines still dutifully performing their functions, for no one. The soldiers swept through the empty streets in formation, and every one of them felt it. The sensation of being watched by something that left no trace. Back in orbit, a communications officer frowned at her console. Signals across several channels were behaving strangely, echoing, fragmenting, returning to their source with delays that didn't correspond to any physical obstacle she could identify. She flagged it for the technicians and received the explanation she expected. Solar interference, probably. Nothing to worry about. Then a patrol cruiser on the fleet's far edge reported something that couldn't be explained away so easily. A sense of contact, brief and enormous, a shape so large it shouldn't have been able to disappear, visible for less than a second before vanishing as completely as if it had never existed. No residual energy signature. No debris. No drive wash. Nothing. The contact was logged as sensor malfunction and quietly filed. Admiral Krell stood in the silence of the empty colony and felt the first cold thread of unease unspooling in his chest. He had conquered worlds before. He knew what fear looked like in a population. He knew what it smelled like in the air of a city. This wasn't fear. This was something else entirely, and he didn't have a name for it yet. The fleet pressed deeper into human territory, and the small problems began to accumulate. Navigation signal flickered, not catastrophically, just enough to require correction, enough to make pilots uncertain of their precise positioning for a few disorienting seconds at a time. Star charts shifted by fractions of a degree, forcing constant recalibration. Encrypted communications arrived distorted, as though the messages were traveling through some invisible labyrinth before reaching their destination. The technicians worked double shifts and found nothing. Every system tested clean. Every diagnostic returned nominal. Whatever was interfering with their equipment left no fingerprints. A destroyer on the outer patrol circuit reported the ghost contact again, the same massive shape drifting just beyond the resolution limit of their long-range arrays, present for 10 seconds, gone in the 11th. The destroyer turned to pursue and ran a full active scan. Empty space. 18 minutes later, the destroyer vanished from the fleet's tracking network. No explosion preceded it. No distress signal. No debris cloud expanding from its last known position. Simply, there, and then not there, the way a word sometimes disappears from memory mid-sentence, leaving only the shape of the absence behind. Command logged it as a catastrophic systems failure. The fleet continued forward, but the crews had stopped sleeping well. On the captured colony sites, soldiers reported experiences that couldn't be easily categorized. Motion sensors in sealed corridors triggered and reset. Footsteps echoed in empty storage halls, distinct, measured footsteps that matched no one's gait and corresponded to no one's location. Exterior surveillance cameras caught shadows moving across the frozen ground outside sealed perimeters. Fleeting, sourceless, gone before they could be frozen and analyzed. Officers explained it as equipment stress. The cold, the strange atmospheric pressure of alien worlds. Soldiers, they said, imagine things when they were overwrought. And yet no fault could be found in any piece of equipment. On the flagship, a junior communications officer named Ver sat alone at her station during a late watch cycle and detected something buried so deep beneath the background radiation of space that she initially dismissed it as instrument noise. She almost didn't flag it. She almost logged off and went to sleep. But she listened to it for a long time, because something about its structure wouldn't let her look away. The signal repeated. Complex patterns cycling through permutations that were too precise, too deliberate, too deeply organized to be anything produced by stellar mechanics or cosmic radiation. Whatever was generating them had intent. Unidentified transmission, she reported quietly to the watch commander. Source. She hesitated for a long time, staring at her console, trying to find an answer that made physical sense. Finally, she said, "It's everywhere, nowhere, sir. I can't isolate it." Long-range gravitational sensors began detecting something shortly after, subtle ripples moving through the fabric of space around the fleet, like tremors passing through still water when something massive moves beneath the surface. The ripples were consistent and rhythmic. They were not random. They were not natural. The fleet tightened its formation. Weapons went to standby. Officers stared at their displays with a particular tension of people who have been trained to respond to threats they can see and now find themselves surrounded by something they cannot. Nothing attacked. Nothing appeared. The silence deepened until it had weight and texture, until you could feel it pressing against the hull like deep water, until even the officers who had crossed into human space full of contempt and certainty found themselves talking in lower voices without knowing why. They had taken 7 colonies without firing a single shot. The numbers should have felt like victory. Admiral Krell stood at the viewport of his command deck and stared at the star field and felt nothing that resembled triumph. The human territories they moved through were alive, bustling with commerce, humming with industry, populated with ships and stations, and the unmistakable activity of a civilization at full function. And yet the fleet moved through it all like a stone thrown into a river. It created no disruption, provoked no response, warranted no apparent notice. It felt wrong in a way Krell couldn't articulate to his officers because he couldn't fully articulate it to himself. Conquered peoples behaved in recognizable ways. They hid. They panicked. They organized desperate resistance or they collapsed into submission. But they reacted. They acknowledged the force that had come for them. These people simply continued existing, as though the Alliance Armada were invisible, or as though they knew something the Armada didn't. Krell had stopped sleeping in his quarters. He stood his watches of the command deck and drank cold stimulants and turned the problem over and over in his mind like a stone he couldn't find the underside of. He was a man who understood power. He had spent his career reading it in the behavior of enemies and allies alike. And what he felt now, moving through the eerie, indifferent calm of human space, was a particular unease of a predator who has walked confidently into unfamiliar terrain and is beginning to suspect, too late, that the terrain itself is a trap. The warning came on the 14th day. It cut through Alliance communication frequencies without preamble, without static, without the polite diplomatic formality that species use when they wanted to avoid conflict. It was simply there, suddenly, on every channel simultaneously, clear and precise and almost bald in its delivery, like a reminder issued to someone who should have known better. This is your final chance. Turn back, then silence. The command deck went very still. Officers exchanged glances. Someone dropped a data tablet, and the clatter was obscenely loud in the quiet that followed. Admiral Krell stared at the communication array, something tight and cold moving through his chest. A warning. After 14 days of absolute silence, after 7 colonies taken without a single protest, after a fleet of hundreds of warships had penetrated deep into their territory, now a warning. Not a declaration of war. Not a threat of force. Not the scrambled emergency broadcast of a government finally realizing the gravity of what was happening. Just that. Calm. Patient. Certain. This is your final chance. Turn back. Ooh, days. He began, and the words died in his throat, because the navigation systems went dark. Not with alarms, not with the frantic cascade of error signals that preceded a genuine malfunction. Simply dark, the way a candle goes out when someone places a hand over it. Every display on the command deck flickered once and stabilized into readings that no longer corresponded to any position in known space. And then the long-range arrays lit up, not gradually, not with the slow resolution of distant contacts coming into sensor range, all at once, as though someone had simply decided to allow them to be seen. Hundreds of ships materialized from the darkness surrounding the Alliance fleet, from every direction, from distances that meant they had been there, all of them, for an unknowable length of time. They were unlike anything in the Alliance's recognition database. Not because they were strange in shape, they were, in fact, elegantly simple, their lines clean and purposeful in a way that things built by people who have solved every problem they needed to solve tend to look. What was strange was what they lacked. They produced almost no energy signature. They carried no visible weapon systems in the configurations the Alliance recognized. They emitted no communication signals, no navigation beacons, nothing that a sensor array was designed to find. They had been invisible because they had been designed to be invisible, and they had been designed to be invisible so thoroughly and so long ago that the Alliance's best technology had spent 14 days looking directly at them and seen nothing. Hundreds of them, surrounding the entire armada. Admiral Krell looked at the tactical display, at the spreading net of contacts that had closed around his fleet like fingers closing into a fist, and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of military command. He felt genuinely, profoundly afraid, not of the ships themselves, but of what they represented, of what their presence meant about every assumption he had brought into human space. They had not appeared to fight. They had appeared to demonstrate that they had always been there. "Sir," his weapons officer's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, our weapon systems." Krell already knew. He could see it on every console. The enormous guns that had leveled fortifications on 6 worlds, silenced, not disabled by damage, not shorted out by electromagnetic attack. Simply off, as though someone had reached into the architecture of his ships and politely switched them to standby. Missile systems reported targeting malfunctions. Shield harmonics destabilized. Collapse refused to reinitialize. Communication arrays went dark one by one, leaving only a single channel open. The channel the humans chose to leave open, for reasons Krell was only beginning to understand. "They've hacked into our systems." An officer's voice cracked with something between fury and disbelief. "They've been in our systems," Krell said quietly. He understood now. The navigation flickers, the communication delays, the ghost contacts, the equipment that tested clean while performing strangely. They hadn't been glitches. They had been fingers exploring, learning the architecture of every Alliance ship with patient, methodical thoroughness, learning exactly how to reach inside and turn things off if the need arose. The need had arisen. Not a shot fired, not a single crew member killed, not a single piece of Alliance hardware destroyed. Just off. The most powerful armada the Orion Alliance had deployed in 60 years, reduced to a collection of expensive, inert metal objects, held in perfect stillness by a force that had never needed to announce itself. Into the open channel, the one the humans had left deliberately, precisely, came a voice. It was not angry. It was not triumphant. It carried the calm of something that has never doubted the outcome of the situation it is describing. "You mistook our silence for weakness. You were wrong." The words hung in the recycled air of the command deck like smoke. Krell looked at his crew, at the faces of officers who had crossed into human space certain of an easy conquest, who had stood on the decks of the most powerful ships in the known galaxy and felt invincible. He looked at them now, in the absolute stillness of a fleet that had been neutralized without violence, and understood that every one of them was experiencing the same fundamental recalibration that was happening inside him. They had not misread humanity's capability. They had misread something far more significant. They had misread humanity's character. A species from a death world, from storms and predators and the grinding brutality of a planet that tried to kill everything it produced, had not become warriors because it could. They had become something the galaxy had no good word for: patient, strategic, possessed of a willingness to absorb provocation without reaction until the precise moment when reaction would be definitive. They hadn't been silent because they were afraid. They had been silent because they were finished being observed and ready to begin being understood. The human voice came through the open channel one final time, and this time it was not addressed to Admiral Krell alone. It carried the quality of something meant to travel further, to be remembered, repeated, carried back across the border, and spoken in council chambers and military briefings and diplomatic halls for a very long time. The galaxy will know this truth. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strength. We do not seek war. We seek peace. But if you cross our borders again, we will show you what true power looks like. Admiral Krell stood for a long moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, straightened his uniform, and said the words that cost him more than any battle he had ever fought or lost. "Stand down," he said. "Signal the fleet. We are withdrawing." The order moved through the armada like a wave, and the great engines of the Orion war fleet began, slowly, to turn the ships around, back toward the border, back toward their own space. The human ships did not follow. They did not need to. They held their positions, silent, unmoving, watching, as the Alliance armada retreated through the space it had entered with such confidence 2 weeks before. No celebration came through the open channel. No mockery. No parting threat. The humans had said what they needed to say, and they had said it with the economy of people who understood that the most powerful statements are the ones that require nothing added to them. The last thing Admiral Krell saw on the tactical display, before the human fleet winked out of sensor range, was what they had looked like at the moment of revelation: hundreds of ships emerging from total invisibility, not to destroy, not to conquer, but simply to be seen. He thought about that for a long time on the journey home. He thought about the empty colonies, their lights still burning, the ghost contact that had never been errors, the signals buried in the background noise of space, the 14 days of silence that had not been helplessness, but preparation, the long, unhurried preparation of a species that had learned patience from a planet that gave nothing easily, that had learned to endure because endurance was what it took to survive, and that had carried that lesson into the stars with them like a second genome. They had been watching the Alliance watch them. They had learned every ship, every weapon, every communication protocol, every vulnerability. They had built their response around complete understanding of the threat they faced, and then they had waited, not in fear, not in desperation, but with the absolute confidence of people who know exactly what they are capable of and have no need to demonstrate it until the moment demands it. The Orion Alliance filed its report to the High Council 11 days later. The language was careful, precise, and stripped of every boastful clause that had characterized the original authorization for military action. Several senior council members called for a second attempt. Several admirals suggested that the fleet had encountered an anomaly, a trick that could be countered, a technology that could be reverse-engineered, a weakness that simply hadn't been found yet. Admiral Krell sat through these arguments in silence, and when they were finished he said only one thing: "They let us leave." The room went quiet. "They had us," he said, "completely. Every ship, every weapon, every man and woman on every deck in that fleet, at their mercy. And they let us go. They chose peace when they had already won the war." He looked around the room at the faces of the High Council, proud faces, certain faces, faces that had not been there in the stillness of that surrounded fleet. "The next time we cross their border, they will not offer us the choice again. And I promise you, you do not want to know what they look like when they are not choosing peace." No second expedition was authorized. Across the galaxy, in the months that followed, the story moved the way all true stories move, imperfectly, embellished in some places and diminished in others, but fundamentally intact, because its truth was too strange and too complete to be easily distorted. A fleet of hundreds, disabled without casualties, released without conditions, sent home with a message that carried no anger in it, only clarity. Some species called it mercy. Some called it a demonstration. Some called it a warning. The humans, when asked about it, said very little, which told the galaxy everything it needed to know. For centuries, the galaxy had watched humanity with a mixture of fascination and quiet dismissal. They had emerged from a brutal world, a death world, by every measurable standard. A planet of raging storms and tectonic violence, of predators that hunted in packs through darkness, of diseases that mutated faster than they could be cured, of floods and fires and ice ages that should have extinguished the species a dozen times over. By every law of nature the wider galaxy understood, the creatures born from such a crucible should have been warriors to their marrow, violent, territorial, impossible to reason with. And yet, humanity traded. They explored. When small colony species found themselves on the edge of collapse, their crops failing, their infrastructure crumbling, it was often a human freighter that arrived first, its cargo bays full and its crew asking nothing in return but goodwill. When wars erupted between the great powers of the galaxy, devastating civilizations that had stood for millennia, humanity watched from a careful distance. They offered no armies, no weapons, no political leverage. They simply watched and listened and said nothing. To most of the galaxy, this was confusing. To the Orion Alliance, it was proof of something far simpler. Weakness. The Alliance was old, powerful, and utterly certain of both facts. Its empire stretched across 4 star systems, its military doctrine refined over 800 years of territorial expansion. Its admirals were chosen not merely for tactical brilliance, but for particular quality the Alliance valued above all others, the absolute willingness to act. Hesitation, to the Orion mind, was the seed of extinction. You identified weakness. You moved against it. You absorbed it before it could become a problem. Humanity, by every indicator available, was weak. Alliance scouts had spent 18 months conducting thorough surveillance of human border systems, and what they found had bordered on insulting. Patrol fleets were small, a handful of light cruisers stretched in across vast distances. Outer colonies sat beneath the open sky without a single orbital defense platform to protect them. No vast armadas waited in hidden staging grounds. No fortifications lined the borders. There were satellites, certainly long-range observation arrays, clearly military in origin, and the humans undoubtedly knew the scouts were there. They tracked every ship. They logged every pass. And they said nothing. No warnings. No diplomatic protests. No military escorts arriving to shadow Alliance vessels and make their presence known. The response to 18 months of aggressive intelligence gathering was complete, unbroken silence. Admiral Krell reviewed the final intelligence report aboard his flagship and leaned back in his command chair with something approaching contempt. "Deaf worlders," he said, letting the word sit in the air of the command deck. "And yet they hide." He turned to look at his chief intelligence officer. "They see us, don't they? Quite clearly. Their arrays are sophisticated, Admiral. They have precise readings on every ship we've deployed. And still, nothing." He almost smiled. "They are afraid of us." The High Council had reached the same conclusion within 48 hours of receiving his report. The authorization for military action came through 3 days later, accompanied by the largest fleet deployment the Alliance had authorized in 60 years. Battleships, heavy carriers, troop transports carrying enough soldiers to occupy a dozen worlds simultaneously. The armada assembled at the edge of human space like a storm front gathering on the horizon, visible to any telescope, detectable by any sensor array worth its power consumption. Earth transmitted nothing.